Some say this is probably the worst bus ever built. Others say that its problems were overblown or even imaginary. This is New York City's notorious Grumman Flxible 870. Hi, this is Jeffrey, and in this video, we're going to go back to the year 1984, and we're going to take a look at the Grumman Flxible 870 bus crisis of New York City. Now, in 1980, the New York City Transit Authority and the Manhattan and Bronx Surface Transit Operating Authority started to receive the first of a fleet of 851 Grumman Flxible 870 buses. Not too long after they started to receive the first buses, they noticed some problems with them, such as cracked underframes and steering column issues. And so the buses that they had at the time, they pulled them off the streets in 1980. Fast forward to 1984, they were still having a lot of problems with them. And then in February of 1984, they decided to pull the entire fleet of Grumman Flxible 870 buses off the streets permanently, never to be seen again. Now, there's a very good article from the night before they pulled all of these 870 buses off the streets from the New York Times, and we are going to review that article and see exactly what the issues were and how the MTA was working on a solution to all of the gaps that they were going to have in bus service at that time. So let's get started in reviewing this New York Times article from February of 1984 about the city's Grumman bus crisis. And so here's the article from the New York Times. All Grumman buses to be put off streets in city permanently, by Suzanne Daly, dated February 8, 1984. After barely 4 years of service, New York City's entire fleet of Grumman buses were pulled from city streets last night for being unsafe, the Transit Authority said. The loss of the 851 buses, about one-fifth of the city's total, will seriously affect service in the city, the authority's president David L. Gunn said at a news conference at the authority's headquarters in Brooklyn. But Mr. Gunn, who took office less than a week ago, said he could no longer risk running the buses. Service will be bad for a while, he said, but there are enough potential accidents and problems with a transit system without having the Grummans too. The Flxible buses have a long history of mechanical defects that began almost as soon as they went into service in 1980. In the last week alone, the authority discovered new flaws in a large number of them, and one Grumman bus burst into flames on a midtown street as it was being taken out of service. It has reached a point where we can't guarantee the safety of those vehicles, Mr. Gunn said. I don't want to expose passengers to the risk of that bus. He said no decision had been made as to what would be done with the buses, except that they would be parked on city property. Mr. Gunn said the authority had not decided whether it was possible to sue the manufacturer of the bus, the Grumman Flxible Corporation. He also said he had no plans yet on how to replace the buses. The authority has about 3,900 buses, not all of them in running order, and needs about 3,200 for normal service at peak hours. About 1.75 million people ride the city's buses each weekday. Mr. Gunn said that the authority would try over the weekend to restore 270 old reserve buses. However, even with additional old buses, the authority is likely to be several hundred buses short, he said. Cracks in undercarriages. Once before, the authority pulled all of its Grumman buses out of service. In 1980, shortly after the first batch of buses was delivered, cracks were discovered in the undercarriages of a large number of them, and the entire fleet was taken out of service for almost a year while repairs were made. At that time, the authority rented buses from Washington, D.C. Mr. Gunn said he would not try to borrow any old buses this time. All we'd be doing is borrowing other people's troubles, he said. He said the authority had begun pulling the buses out of service as they came into their depots last night. The flexible buses are concentrated in 6 depots: the 54th Street Depot in Manhattan, the Fresh Pond and Ulmer Park depots in Brooklyn, the Queens Village Depot in Queens, the Castleton Depot on Staten Island, and the Coliseum Depot in the Bronx. Transit officials said the loss of the flexible buses would affect about 70 routes throughout the city in this morning's rush hour. Mr. Gunn said buses would be shuffled around the authority's 20 depots to even out service over the next few days. Division sold by Grumman. The cost of each Grumman bus was between $99,000 and $121,000. They were made by the Grumman Flxible Corporation, then a subsidiary of the Grumman Corporation. Last year, Grumman sold the Flxible division to the Flxible Corporation, a subsidiary of the General Automotive Corporation of Ann Arbor, Michigan. A spokesman for the Grumman Corporation, Wayman B. Jones, said yesterday that the authority had not told Grumman of its actions. Mr. Jones said that Grumman had retained all responsibility for the flexible warranties despite the sale of its Flxible division. He said the company's preliminary findings about the city's problems with the flexibles were that they seemed to be directly related to potholes in the streets and other operating conditions for the buses there. Mr. Jones also said Grumman had requested maintenance reports on the buses and had not received them yet. He added that Grumman had been refused permission to inspect the bus that caught fire. We believe that was an isolated incident, he said. Gouges in steering shaft. Last month, the authority found that almost half the Grummans had steering assembly problems. A bearing that was supposed to hold the steering shaft steady in its outer sleeve was breaking up and causing gouges in the shaft. In one instance, the bearing caused a steering shaft to break in two. About 60 of the buses with the steering problem were still out of service when Mr. Gunn decided to retire the entire fleet. Last week, the authority called another emergency inspection, this time finding that 46 buses had problems with brackets that hold up the front axle assembly and that 116 others had cracks in the floor near the rear wheel wells. Last Friday, a flexible bus running an express route from Brooklyn caught fire on 57th Street near 5th Avenue around 9 a.m., just after its last passengers had gotten off. Mayor Koch later said that the authority should junk the flexibles and open up whatever settlement was entered into with Grumman and get cash and buy new buses. In the last few weeks, there have been growing demands for the bus's removal. Carol Bellamy, the city council president, who is a member of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority Board, which oversees the transit authority, called for action against Grumman several weeks ago, as did Andrew J. Stein, Manhattan's borough president. New buses from GM. Since finding the cracks in the undercarriages of the flexible buses in 1980, the authority has bought 1,500 new buses, all made by General Motors. New York is not the only city to have flawed Grumman flexible buses. Cracks in the undercarriages of the buses were found in Hartford, Chicago, and Los Angeles, among other cities. Houston put its Grumman flexible buses up for sale shortly after acquiring them. New Jersey Transit has found that some of its Grumman buses had the same steering assembly problem as New York. Mr. Gunn laughed yesterday when asked whether he was considering selling the fleet. "You bring me the buyer, I'll be glad to talk," he said. And that's the end of the article. Well, that was quite an interesting article, wasn't it? So now you know everything or almost everything about the Grumman bus crisis in New York of 1984. Now, I remember this. I remember when they pulled the buses off the streets the first time in 1980 because I was in junior high school back then and I used to take the Coney Island Avenue bus or the B68 as it's known to school. And the B68 was one of the first lines to get the Grumman Flxible 870 and to be like, I think it was fully equipped with Grumman Flxible 870s pretty quickly. So when they pulled them all off the streets, you had to wait like 30 minutes or so for a bus. Luckily, the walk wasn't all that terrible, and I, walked to school instead of taking the bus when they pulled all of the Grummans off the street. Now, another interesting aspect to this was that I read another article on this whole issue, and the unions that represented the mechanics said that they didn't really see any problem with the buses, that any issues that they had were easily fixable, and that their members can, quickly repair the buses when and as needed. Now, the MTA then accused the union of liking these buses because it gave their members extra overtime pay. And then the union denied such a charge. So, there was a lot going on back and forth. But ultimately, the transit authority pulled all of the buses off the streets. And I think many years later, the transit authority actually was looking into buying the Flxible Metro, which was like an updated version of the Flxible 870, but they didn't do that. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, which is the look back to the 1984 Grumman bus crisis. And thank you very, very much for watching. And as always, have a great day. Bye.